The story of Nancy Wake is the story of an ordinary woman who became one of World War II's most extraordinary resistance fighters. Born Nancy Grace Augusta Wake on August 30th, 1912, in Wellington, New Zealand, she would eventually be hunted as the Gestapo's most wanted person, a woman they called the White Mouse because she always seemed to slip through their fingers. But before the wars, before the parachutes, before the bare-knuckle combat against the Nazis, Nancy was simply a girl who dreamed of adventure beyond the confines of her small world. Nancy was born in Roseneath, Wellington, during a period of relative peace and prosperity in the British Empire. She was the youngest of 6 children born to Charles Augustus Wake and Ella Rosier Wake. Her family carried a quiet historical distinction. Nancy's great-grandmother, Perea, was of Maori descent, specifically of the Ngati Mahanga Iwi, and was believed to be one of the first Maori women to marry a European. This heritage, though not widely spoken of in her early years, would later mark her as a woman comfortable navigating between worlds, a quality that would prove invaluable in her resistance work. In 1914, just 2 years after Nancy's birth, her family emigrated to Australia, settling in North Sydney, New South Wales. Her father, Charles, returned to New Zealand not long after, leaving her mother, Ella Wake, born Ella Rosier in 1874, to raise 6 children largely alone in a foreign land. This early separation and her mother's resilience would become formative influences on young Nancy, instilling in her a fierce independence and determination that shaped every decision she would later make. Nancy's formal education was limited, but focused. She attended the North Sydney Household Art School, a home science institution designed to prepare young women for domestic life. The curriculum emphasized practical skills, cooking, needlework, household management, the conventional path prescribed for girls of her era. But Nancy, even as a child, showed little inclination toward convention. At just 16 years old, in 1928, she ran away from home, rejecting the predictable future her schooling promised. She took work as a nurse, moving between towns, supporting herself with determination and resourcefulness that astonished those who knew her. At 20, armed with 200 pounds she had inherited from a deceased aunt, a significant sum in the late 1920s, Nancy made a decisive break. She journeyed first to New York City, then to London, where she pursued formal training in journalism. This was no small ambition for a young woman of the era. Journalism was a field largely dominated by men, and the competition was fierce. But Nancy possessed the determination and intelligence to succeed. By the early 1930s, she had established herself as a journalist and European correspondent for the prestigious Hearst newspaper group. This position gave her extraordinary access and opportunity. She traveled across Europe, interviewing major political figures, reporting on cultural developments, and witnessing firsthand the rise of fascism across the continent. She was in Paris during the height of its cultural and artistic renaissance, living among writers, artists, and thinkers. She worked in Vienna, Prague, and across Central Europe, her byline appearing regularly in American publications, her reputation growing as a writer of acumen and perspective. It was during these professional travels that Nancy witnessed something that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her life. In Vienna, Austria, in 1933, as Adolf Hitler rose to power and Nazi ideology began to permeate German and Austrian society, Nancy watched, in person, in the streets, the systematic brutalization of Jewish civilians by Nazi paramilitary organizations. In her own later recounting, she described seeing Schutzstaff's officers, SS men, tie Jewish men and women to torture wheels in the middle of the street, beating them with clubs and whips, while crowds watched in horror and silence. That moment crystallized something in Nancy's conscience. In a 1945 interview, she would recall her reaction with clarity. "I stood there, and I thought, that's dreadful. I couldn't whip a cat. If ever I can do something one day, I'll do it." It was not a passing thought or a rhetorical flourish. It was a personal vow, a commitment that would structure the remainder of her life. In 1937, while living in Marseille, already a city of intrigue, smuggling, and political ferment, Nancy met Henri Edmond Fiocca, a wealthy French industrialist and businessman of considerable means and social standing. Fiocca was born in 1898, making him 13 years her senior, established and secure in a way that appealed to Nancy's practical nature. They married on November 30th, 1939, just as the political crisis in Europe was reaching a breaking point. For a brief moment, Nancy lived a life of comfort and privilege. The couple entertained in their luxury apartment overlooking Marseille Harbor, attended dinner parties with champagne and caviar, and moved through circles of money and influence. But that world of peace and comfort was not to last. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. On June 22, 1940, after a rapid military campaign, France fell to Nazi occupation. The French government was forced to capitulate, and the nation was divided. Northern France and the Atlantic coast fell under direct German military occupation. The southern portion was nominally governed by an authoritarian French regime based in Vichy, Marshal Peyton's puppet administration, which collaborated extensively with Nazi Germany. Marseille, located in the unoccupied Vichy zone initially, suddenly became a city of extraordinary danger and opportunity. It was here that Nancy Wake's private conscience, born in Vienna, crystallized in her youthful vow, would become public action. Standing in her luxury apartment with her wealthy husband, surrounded by every comfort a woman of her time could wish, Nancy Wake made a choice that would define not only her life, but the lives of thousands of resistance fighters, downed Allied airmen, and civilians desperate to escape Nazi persecution. She chose to become a spy.
In the autumn of 1940, with France defeated and divided between German occupation and Vichy collaboration, Nancy Wake made a choice that would define the next 3 years of her life. Instead of retreating into the comfortable isolation of her wealthy lifestyle in Marseille, she stepped into the shadows. The catalyst came in December of that year, a chance encounter in the lobby of the Hôtel du Louvre in Marseille with a British officer on the run from German forces. That meeting led her to Captain Ian Garrow, a Scottish officer of the British Army who had been left behind after the fall of France. Garrow had already begun organizing an escape network to help Allied airmen and soldiers evade capture and reach neutral Spain. Nancy saw her opportunity. She possessed what few resistance workers had: wealth, connections, social standing, and the freedom of movement that came with being the wife of a prominent French businessman. She also possessed the language skills, fluent in French, English, German, and Italian, and a fearlessness that made her ideally suited for the dangerous game of resistance work. Beginning in late 1940, she became a courier for Garrow's emerging network, which would soon be known as the Pat O'Leary Line, named after the pseudonym of Lieutenant Commander Albert Marie Guéris, a Belgian officer in the Royal Navy who took over the network's leadership in 1941. Her work was deceptively simple on the surface. She carried messages between resistance cells, transported forged documents, helped arrange safe houses, and most critically, acted as a liaison between fugitive Allied airmen and escape guides. But the danger underlying each mission was absolute. The Gestapo, Geheimnis Staatspolizei, the Nazi secret police, had established an overwhelming presence throughout occupied France and increasingly in Vichy territory as well. Discovery meant not interrogation and imprisonment, but torture and death. By December 1940, just weeks after her recruitment, Nancy had already transformed her luxurious apartment overlooking Marseille Harbor into a clandestine safe house. On Christmas Day of that year, she hosted an extraordinary gathering. 15 Allied evaders, soldiers and airmen who had escaped German capture, sat down for Christmas dinner in her home. Among them was Ian Garrow himself, who was then organizing the escape routes that would become the backbone of the Pat O'Leary Line. The apartment became known throughout the network as a refuge, a place where desperate men could find food, rest, medical attention, and most importantly, hope. When the volume of refugees threatened to overwhelm the apartment and endanger her husband, Henri, Nancy used her own money to rent a separate safe house, a crucial operational base that stored not only refugees but weapons, ammunition, and critical supplies for the resistance movement. Her role evolved rapidly from near courier to operational manager. She became responsible for screening fugitives, verifying their identities, and determining which routes they should take toward Spain. She worked with forgers to create false identity papers, arrange transport, and maintain contact with guides, often Spanish Republicans who had fled Franco's Spain and were determined to strike back at fascism in any form. The Pat O'Leary line was organized with remarkable sophistication. Fugitives were passed from safe house to safe house, each step of the journey meticulously planned, each guide vetted for reliability and security. The statistics tell part of the story. Between 1940 and 1943, the Pat O'Leary line helped over 600 Allied personnel escape occupied France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Many were downed RAF pilots or American airmen from bomber aircraft shot down over occupied Europe. Some were soldiers cut off during the fighting. A significant number were Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. The network stretched from northern France all the way to the Pyrenees Mountains on the Spanish border, a distance of nearly 1,000 kilometers. Nancy Wake, despite her relative inexperience, became one of the most trusted figures in this network, a woman whose judgment was respected and whose courage was tested repeatedly. Her identity became known to the Gestapo, though not yet her name or her exact location. They called her the White Mouse, a reference to her ability to evade capture, to slip through checkpoints, to disappear when danger appeared. By 1942, they had placed a reward on her head, 5 million French francs, an enormous sum, equivalent to the annual wages of hundreds of working people. The message was clear: the Nazis were hunting her. Then came November 1942, an event that transformed the entire calculus of her security. Operation Torch, the American and British invasion of French North Africa, triggered a fateful German response. Hitler, fearing that Vichy France would now become a target for Allied invasion from the south, ordered German and Italian troops to occupy the Vichy zone on November 11, 1942. The previously safe southern portion of France suddenly came under direct German military control. The Gestapo now had unrestricted access to all of Vichy France, including Marseille. Nancy's ability to operate openly, even with false papers and careful disguise, evaporated overnight. In the months that followed, the Pat O'Leary line was penetrated by German agents. A resistance member named Le Neveu, who had worked his way into the network's confidence by successfully escorting groups of refugees, was revealed to be a Gestapo informant. The line began to unravel. In March 1943, Albert Muddy Geddes, the leader and namesake of the Pat O'Leary line, was arrested in Marseille. Other arrests followed. It became clear to Nancy that her time in France was running out. By early 1943, she made the decision to escape. The plan was complex. She would travel overland to the Pyrenees and cross into Spain, from where she could reach Britain and continue her war against Nazi Germany. But the journey would prove far more harrowing than she anticipated. In April 1943, while traveling by train from Marseille toward Perpignan, near the Spanish border, with a group of Allied evaders she was attempting to escort to safety, a railway official suddenly appeared in their compartment with urgent news. German troops were preparing to board the train and conduct a thorough search. Without hesitation, Nancy opened the window and jumped. The evaders followed. Gunfire erupted from the train as German soldiers began shooting at the fleeing fugitives. Nancy scrambled through nearby vineyards, abandoning her handbag with her jewels, her identity papers, and her walking boots. What followed was a desperate odyssey. She made 5 separate attempts to cross the Pyrenees. 5 times she and her companions reached the mountains. 5 times they were turned back, by weather, by German patrols, or by guides who lost their nerve. Finally, after 47 hours of brutal climbing through mountain passes in winter conditions, she crossed into Spain on her 6th attempt. She was utterly exhausted, her feet raw and bleeding, her body pushed to the limits of human endurance. But even as Nancy was edging toward safety in Spain, even as she was moving farther away from German reach,
Something terrible was happening to the man that she had left behind. Henri Fiocca, her husband, had been arrested by the Gestapo. They wanted to know where Nancy was. They tortured him, severely, methodically, with all the cruelty for which the Gestapo was infamous. But Henri Edmond Fiocca, despite the agony, refused to break. He gave them nothing. He protected his wife even as they destroyed his body. In 1943, he was executed. Nancy would not learn of his death until the war ended in 1945. For 2 years, she carried the hope that he had survived, that he might have escaped or been liberated by Allied forces. That hope would turn to bitter grief when the truth finally emerged. She would spend the rest of her life carrying the weight of that guilt, the knowledge that her choice to fight the Nazis had ultimately cost the life of the man she loved.
Nancy Wake arrived in Britain in June 1943, a woman transformed by 3 years of clandestine warfare. She was 31 years old, battle-hardened, and carrying memories of Henri left behind in France, though she did not yet know of his death. Her first challenge was persuading the British establishment that she should be trained as a professional agent. There was considerable bureaucratic resistance to her recruitment. She had initially approached the Free French forces, but they viewed her with suspicion. They questioned whether a woman of her background and temperament could be trusted with sensitive intelligence work. The Free French rejected her, and it appeared that her role in the war effort might effectively be over. But Nancy possessed something more valuable than official approval: connections and determination. A friend suggested that she contact Maurice Buckmaster, the head of the French section of the British Special Operations Executive. Buckmaster was one of the war's remarkable figures, a man who understood that victory against Nazi Germany required unconventional methods and unconventional people. He listened to Nancy's experience, her fluency in languages, her proven ability to evade German security, and her intimate knowledge of the French resistance network. More than that, he saw in her someone with the courage and moral clarity that the SOE required. Buckmaster approved her recruitment immediately. By July 1943, Nancy Wake had officially become a member of the Special Operations Executive, assigned to the French section with the designation First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, a cover designation that masked her true role as a combat operative. Her training was rigorous and comprehensive. The SOE maintained several training facilities across Britain, carefully selected for their secrecy and suitability for clandestine work. Nancy's training began at Wanborough Manor in Surrey, a country house that served as the SOE's preliminary assessment center. Here, potential agents underwent psychological evaluation, fitness testing, and initial instruction in fieldcraft and security procedures. Those who passed moved to more advanced facilities. Nancy trained at various locations, including the Scottish Highlands, where she learned advanced combat techniques, survival skills, and demolition work. She was instructed in the use of explosives, firearms, and hand-to-hand combat by experienced SOE instructors. According to training reports preserved in the National Archives, Nancy Wake impressed her instructors across every dimension. She was noted as a very good and fast shot with pistols and rifles. In hand-to-hand combat, she displayed exceptional strength and aggression. Most remarkably, she put the men to shame by her cheerful spirit and strength of character. Vera Atkins, the senior female officer overseeing female agents in the French section of SOE, who would become a legendary figure in the organization's history, described Nancy in stark terms: a real Australian bombshell, tremendous vitality, flashing eyes. Everything she did well. By late 1943, Nancy had completed her formal SOE training, including instruction at RAF Ringway near Manchester, the SOE's parachute training facility. She had executed multiple practice jumps, mastering the techniques of nighttime parachute insertion behind enemy lines. She had learned radio operation, Morse code, and the complex procedures for encrypting and decrypting messages to and from London. She studied the latest German military organization, security procedures, and counterintelligence operations. She was equipped with forged identity documents, emergency rations, a cyanide pill, standard issue for SOE agents in case of capture, and a small arsenal of personal weapons. By April 1944, Nancy Wake was ready to return to occupied France. She was assigned to the Freelance Circuit, an SOE designation for a special operational team being inserted into the Auvergne region of south-central France. The Auvergne had been chosen as a priority target for Allied sabotage operations because of its strategic location, its large population of French resistance, and its proximity to German military installations and supply lines. The region was also home to several independent Maquis groups, guerrilla fighters who had initially formed to evade the German labor conscription program, but who had gradually organized into semi-military units under local leadership. The Freelance Circuit consisted of 3 primary members: Major John Hind Farmer, a career British officer and SOE agent who served as circuit leader under the codename Hubert; Nancy Wake, operating under the codename Helen; and Sergeant Dennis Rake, a signals operator and code specialist who carried the radio equipment that would maintain contact with SOE headquarters in London. All 3 were to be inserted by parachute in a single night operation. The night of April 29th to April 30th, 1944 was selected for insertion. A Royal Air Force Westland Lysander or transport aircraft would carry the team from Britain and drop them over designated drop zones near Montleçon in the Allier department of the Auvergne. The Lysander was a specialized aircraft used extensively by SOE for agent insertion. Fast enough to evade German fighter interception, maneuverable enough to operate from rough landing zones, or to make low-level parachute drops with precision. Nancy jumped into the darkness over occupied France on the night of April 29th to April 30th, 1944. Her parachute deployed, and she began her descent toward the landscape below. But the reception committee on the ground had difficulty locating her in the darkness, and her parachute became snagged in the upper branches of a large tree. Suspended in the canopy, unable to reach the ground, Nancy awaited rescue. It was at this moment that Henri Tardivaux appeared, a French resistance leader of considerable local authority and tactical skill. He was one of the preeminent Maquis commanders in the Auvergne region, a man respected for his competence and aggressive spirit. He had been told to expect the freelance team's arrival, but was not anticipating a woman. Looking up at Nancy, suspended in the tree above him, her parachute tangled in the branches, he reportedly called up in French, with courtly humor, "I hope all the trees in France bear such beautiful fruit this year." Nancy, covered in dirt from the landing, angry at the mishap and in no mood for pleasantries, responded sharply, "Cut out that bullshit and get me out of this tree." The exchange was characteristic. She had returned to France not as a figurehead or liaison officer, but as a soldier and a commander. She had no patience for romantic gestures or patronizing commentary. Her presence in the Auvergne was meant to be functional, dangerous, and consequential. And in the months that followed, Nancy Wake would indeed prove herself to be exactly that.
The Auvergne region, where Nancy Wake landed in late April 1944, was a land in ferment. Mountainous, sparsely populated in many areas, and difficult for the Germans to control with their available forces, it had become a natural stronghold for Maquis groups, guerrilla fighters ranging from a few dozen men to several hundred, organized under local leadership with varying degrees of military experience and political affiliation. Some were communists, dedicated to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Others were Gaullists, fighting to restore French sovereignty under Charles de Gaulle's Free French banner. Still others were simply Frenchmen determined to evade Nazi conscription and resist occupation through any means available. When Nancy arrived, the various Maquis groups numbered between 3,000 and 4,000 fighters spread across the region, lacking unified command, insufficiently armed, poorly coordinated, and vulnerable to German counteroffensive. Her primary mission was to transform these scattered independent cells into a coherent fighting force capable of conducting sustained sabotage and guerrilla operations in support of the impending Allied invasion. She was to organize ammunition and weapons drops, which occurred at regular intervals, roughly 4 times per week, with RAF and SOE aircraft
parachuting supplies into designated drop zones. She was to collect these weapons and distribute them strategically among the various Maquis bands, channeling resources toward the groups most capable of inflicting damage on German forces and installations. She was to maintain radio contact with SOE headquarters in London, providing intelligence on German troop movements, defensive positions, and supply line vulnerabilities. And she was to help coordinate actual military operations against German forces and Vichy collaborationist units. This was a formidable assignment. Major John Hind Farmer, the official circuit leader, held the ultimate command authority. But Farmer was tied to administrative duties, to the complex machinery of liaison and communication that kept the circuit operational. Nancy quickly became the operational commander, the person who traveled constantly between Maquis groups, who trained and motivated the men, who planned and coordinated specific attacks, and who made real-time tactical decisions in the field. She earned the title Chef de Combat, literally combat leader, from the Maquis under her command. The work was relentless and physically demanding. Nancy lived in the forests and mountains of the Auvergne Plateau, often without adequate food, shelter, or sleep. She wore military fatigues or civilian clothes as circumstances required, always armed with a pistol or rifle, ready for immediate combat. She was constantly in motion, traveling between different Maquis encampments, sometimes on foot, sometimes on horseback, sometimes by bicycle or vehicle when roads were safe. The Germans had placed an extraordinary bounty on her head. The reward had increased to the equivalent of millions in 1944 currency. And every German patrol, every collaborationist informant represented the possibility of capture and torture. When Nancy arrived, the various Maquis groups numbered between 3,000 and 4,000 fighters spread across the region, lacking unified command, insufficiently armed, poorly coordinated, and vulnerable to German counteroffensive. Her primary mission was to transform these scattered independent cells into a coherent fighting force capable of conducting sustained sabotage and guerrilla operations in support of the impending Allied invasion. She was to organize ammunition and weapons drops, which occurred at regular intervals, roughly 4 times per week, with RAF and SOE aircraft parachuting supplies into designated drop zones. She was to collect these weapons and distribute them strategically among the various Maquis bands, channeling resources toward the groups most capable of inflicting damage on German forces and installations. She was to maintain radio contact with SOE headquarters in London, providing intelligence on German troop movements, defensive positions, and supply line vulnerabilities. And she was to help coordinate actual military operations against German forces and Vichy collaborationist units.
The Auvergne region, where Nancy Wake landed in late April 1944, was a land in ferment, mountainous, sparsely populated in many areas, and difficult for the Germans to control with their available forces. It had become a natural stronghold for Maquis groups, guerrilla fighters ranging from a few dozen men to several hundred, organized under local leadership with varying degrees of military experience and political affiliation. Some were communists, dedicated to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. Others were Gaullists, fighting to restore French sovereignty under Charles de Gaulle's Free French banner. Still others were simply Frenchmen determined to evade Nazi conscription and resist occupation through any means available. When Nancy arrived, the various Maquis groups numbered between 3,000 and 4,000 fighters spread across the region, lacking unified command, insufficiently armed, poorly coordinated, and vulnerable to German counteroffensive. Her primary mission was to transform these scattered, independent cells into a coherent fighting force capable of conducting sustained sabotage and guerrilla operations in support of the impending Allied invasion. She was to organize ammunition and weapons drops, which occurred at regular intervals, roughly 4 times per week, with RAF and SOE aircraft parachuting supplies into designated drop zones. She was to collect these weapons and distribute them strategically among the various Maquis groups,
channeling resources toward the groups most capable of inflicting damage on German forces and installations. She was to maintain radio contact with SOE headquarters in London, providing intelligence on German troop movements, defensive positions, and supply line vulnerabilities. And she was to help coordinate actual military operations against German forces and Vichy collaborationist units. This was a formidable assignment. Major John Hind Farmer, the official circuit leader, held the ultimate command authority. But Farmer was tied to administrative duties, to the complex machinery of liaison and communication that kept the circuit operational. Nancy quickly became the operational commander, the person who traveled constantly between Maquis groups, who trained and motivated the men, who planned and coordinated specific attacks, and who made real-time tactical decisions in the field. She earned the title Chef de Combat, literally combat leader, from the French Maquis under her command. The work was relentless and physically demanding. Nancy lived in the forests and mountains of the Auvergne Plateau, often without adequate food, shelter, or sleep. She wore military fatigues or civilian clothes as circumstances required, always armed with a pistol or rifle ready for immediate combat. She was constantly in motion, traveling between different Maquis encampments, sometimes on foot, sometimes on horseback, sometimes by bicycle or vehicle when roads were safe. The Germans had placed an extraordinary bounty on her head. The reward had increased to the equivalent of millions in 1944 currency. And every German patrol, every collaborationist informant, represented the possibility of capture and torture. Her primary challenge came even before D-Day. The Maquis, under her coordination, had been tasked with destroying German communications infrastructure and supply lines in the region. Sabotage operations designed to disrupt German military mobilization when the Allies invaded. Between April and early June 1944, the Maquis conducted dozens of attacks on railway lines, cutting tracks at multiple locations to prevent German troop trains from moving toward the coast. They sabotaged telephone and telegraph communications facilities, severing critical German communications networks. They raided German ammunition dumps and supply depots, destroying stocks of fuel, explosives, and equipment. These operations required careful planning, precise timing, and rapid execution, followed by immediate dispersal to avoid German retaliation.
On June 6, 1944, D-Day itself, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The Maquis and the Auvergne accelerated their operations, knowing that every day the German reinforcements could not reach Normandy improved the chances of Allied success. Nancy coordinated waves of coordinated attacks across the region. But the arrival of Allied forces on French soil also triggered a dramatic German response. The Wehrmacht and SS began shifting forces from the interior of France toward the invasion front. Simultaneously, they launched massive counter-offensive operations against the Maquis strongholds in the Auvergne, determined to crush the resistance before it could further disrupt German military operations. The crisis came in mid-June. On June 20, 1944, German forces launched a massive, coordinated offensive against the Maquis stronghold on the plateau above Chaudet-Aigues. The numbers were overwhelming. Approximately 22,000 German soldiers, equipped with tanks, artillery, mortars, and supported by fighter bombers from the Luftwaffe, moved against Nancy's forces of approximately 7,000 Maquis fighters, most of them equipped only with rifles and light weapons, lacking heavy armor, artillery, or air support. The Germans surrounded the plateau, moving methodically to encircle the resistance fighters and destroy them in a decisive engagement. For 3 days, the battle raged. The Maquis fought with desperate courage, but faced an impossible military situation. German artillery and air power inflicted heavy casualties. The resistance fighters were forced to conduct a fighting withdrawal, trying to break out from the German encirclement while inflicting maximum damage on the enemy. Nancy was present throughout the battle, directing troop movements, organizing the retreat, ensuring that the Maquis maintained cohesion and did not dissolve into panic or rout.
In the final accounting, the Maquis suffered approximately 100 dead with additional wounded, a devastating loss for a guerrilla force. But the Germans suffered far worse, approximately 1,400 soldiers killed, according to some accounts, with many additional wounded. More importantly, Nancy's insistence that each Maquis unit maintain escape routes and organized retreat prevented a catastrophic collapse. The fighters broke through the German lines and dispersed into the mountains and forests. But the battle left Nancy's forces scattered and in crisis. The radio operator, Denis Rake, had abandoned his radio and cipher codes during the desperate retreat. Without these communications, Nancy had no way to contact SOE headquarters in London, no way to request additional weapons, supplies, or support. She had to act immediately. On foot initially, then obtaining a bicycle, Nancy undertook one of the most extraordinary journeys of the entire war. She cycled 500 kilometers across occupied France in 72 hours, a distance of over 300 miles, traveling through areas still controlled by German forces, moving by night when possible, relying on her fluent French and her wits to bluff her way through potential German checkpoints. She reached Châteauroux, where she located another SOE radio operator and a functioning radio set. She established contact with London, updated SOE leadership on the military situation in the Auvergne, provided intelligence on German troop dispositions, and arranged for the resumption of supply drops and communications protocols. Then, she turned her bicycle around and cycled back 500 kilometers to Saint-Santin, the village where her Maquis forces had regrouped. The entire round trip took less than 96 hours. When she arrived, exhausted but determined, she immediately began reorganizing the Maquis groups and resuming offensive operations. Throughout July and into August 1944, Nancy coordinated a series of raids and sabotage operations across the Auvergne. In one celebrated raid, later described in various accounts, though some details remain disputed, she participated in an attack on the Gestapo headquarters at Montluçon, the regional capital. The raid was organized with surgical precision. Nancy and a team of French and Spanish Maquis fighters, traveling in several vehicles, arrived at the Gestapo building at exactly 12:25 hours in the afternoon. At 12:30 hours, the Nazis' regular mealtime, the Gestapo officers would be gathered together. The raiders launched a devastating assault, using grenades and machine gun fire to clear each room of the building. Within 30 seconds, they were back in their vehicles and driving away. Numerous Gestapo officers were killed in the attack, dealing a major blow to German security operations in the region and demonstrating the vulnerability of even the most heavily protected Nazi installations. On another occasion, during a raid on a German gun factory, Nancy encountered an SS sentry. Moving swiftly and silently to prevent the man from raising an alarm that would alert the German garrison, she strangled him with her bare hands. An act of brutal efficiency that revealed her complete transformation from the journalist and socialite of her earlier life into a warrior willing to engage in lethal combat at close quarters. In another instance, she executed a German female spy who had been providing intelligence to the Gestapo, preventing the woman from compromising additional resistance networks. By late August 1944, as the German military situation in France collapsed, Nancy Wake and her Maquis forces had evolved from desperate guerrillas defending a mountain plateau into a genuine military force capable of coordinating complex operations across an entire region. The intelligence reports from SOE and the French leadership were clear. No region in occupied France had caused the German military more problems, inflicted more casualties, or tied down more German resources than the Auvergne sector under Nancy Wake's command. She had taken initial Maquis numbers of 3,000 to 4,000 fighters and expanded them to 7,000. She had killed or wounded somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 German soldiers, a kill-casualty ratio that was extraordinary by resistance warfare standards. She had destroyed hundreds of tons of German supplies and disabled critical German infrastructure.
And she had done it all while hunted relentlessly by the Gestapo, operating behind enemy lines with minimal support and resources compared to the massive German military machine arrayed against her.
By late August 1944, the military situation in France had undergone a dramatic transformation. The Normandy invasion in June, combined with the relentless pressure applied by resistance forces throughout occupied France, had broken the German military position. American and British forces advancing from Normandy, combined with newly landed American forces from Operation Dragoon in southern France on August 15, 1944, had begun encircling and destroying German military formations. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, abandoning cities, equipment, and supply depots as German forces attempted to escape toward the Reich. In the Auvergne, the Maquis, under Nancy Wake's command, transitioned from guerrilla resistance into something approaching conventional military operations. As German forces withdrew northward and eastward, Nancy's fighters moved into abandoned German positions, occupied towns and villages, and declared control over the region. The resistance had transformed a scattered collection of guerrilla bands into a genuine military force that now held substantial territory. By September 1944, the liberation of the Auvergne was complete. The region that had been under Nazi occupation and control for over 4 years was now free, and a significant portion of that freedom was directly attributable to the work of Nancy Wake and the men she had trained and led. With the military campaign complete, Nancy Wake's active combat role ended. In September 1944, she left the resistance and traveled to SOE headquarters in Paris, where she provided extensive debriefing and intelligence reports on German military operations, German security procedures, and resistance activities in the Auvergne region. In October 1944, she traveled to London, returning to Britain as the war continued to rage in Germany and on other fronts. For Nancy, the return to England represented a profound psychological shift. She was no longer hunted, no longer operating behind enemy lines, no longer in immediate mortal danger from the Gestapo or Wehrmacht. But it was in England that she learned of the worst tragedy of her life. Henri Edmond Fiocca, her husband, the man who had remained in France after she escaped, had been captured by the Gestapo. He had been tortured, severely and systematically, as the Gestapo routinely tortured prisoners they believed possessed valuable intelligence. They had demanded information about Nancy's whereabouts, about her resistance contacts, about the escape network she had coordinated. Henri, despite extreme pain and suffering, had refused to break. He had protected his wife's secret, even as his torturers destroyed his body. In August 1943, over a year before Nancy learned of it, Henri Fiocca had been executed by Nazi firing squad. The news devastated Nancy. She had carried hope throughout the war that Henri had somehow survived, that he might have been liberated or evaded capture. That hope collapsed in an instant. She was a widow at 32. She had lost the man she loved to the war she had chosen to fight. And though she never publicly blamed herself, the guilt of that loss would mark her for the remainder of her life. She would write in later years that she felt personally responsible for Henri's death, that her decision to join the resistance had brought German attention and ultimately death to the man she loved. Immediately after the war, Nancy Wake's extraordinary service was formally recognized by the governments that had deployed her. The awards came swiftly and generously. On July 17, 1945, she was awarded the George Medal, the highest award the British government could bestow on a non-combatant for bravery and service. The citation described her as an operative who had worked for months, helping to train and instruct Maquis groups. She took part in several engagements with the enemy and showed the utmost bravery under fire. It praised her exceptional courage and coolness in the face of enemy fire, and noted that the Maquis troop, most of them rough and difficult to handle, accepted orders from her
and treated her as one of their own male officers. The United States awarded her the Medal of Freedom in 1947, one of the highest honors the American government can bestow on a non-citizen for exceptional service in support of American interests during wartime. France awarded her the Croix de Guerre with Palm and the Médaille de Résistance. She would receive the Légion d'honneur in 1970, with promotion to Officer of the Legion in 1988. Australia, her adopted home, would later recognize her in 2004 with the Companion of the Order of Australia. New Zealand, her nation of birth, would honor her in 2006 with the RSA Badge in Gold, the highest honor the New Zealand Returned and Services Association can bestow. In total, Nancy Wake would become the most highly decorated female servicewoman of the entire Second World War. But medals and honors could not replace the life she had lost or restore the comfortable world that had existed before 1940. Nancy attempted to integrate back into civilian life, but the transition proved extraordinarily difficult. She had been transformed by war into something that could not easily be untransformed. The conventional peacetime world felt small and meaningless after years of life and death struggle. In 1945 and 1946, she worked as an intelligence officer for the British Air Ministry, attached to the Paris and Prague embassies. But dissatisfaction gnawed at her. In 1949, at age 37, she decided to return to Australia, the nation where she had spent her formative years.
Back in Sydney, Nancy attempted to find purpose in civilian politics. She stood as a Liberal Party candidate against Herbert Veer-Evatt, a prominent Labour politician and deputy leader of the Labour Party, in the 1951 federal election. Her campaign drew attention and excitement. Here was a genuine war hero, the woman the Gestapo had hunted, running for political office. But the Australian electorate was not prepared to elect a woman to Parliament, particularly one whose life had been so unconventional. She lost narrowly, but ran again in 1951, again unsuccessfully. Politics, she discovered, was not a suitable outlet for her restless energy and her desire to serve. Frustrated with Australian civilian life, she returned to England in 1952. Once again, she worked for the British Air Ministry's Intelligence Department, serving under the Assistant Chief of Air Staff at the Air Ministry in Whitehall. For 5 years, she found reasonable satisfaction in intelligence work, a career that demanded the kind of analytical rigor and attention to detail that suited her temperament. Then, in December 1957, she married John Forward, an RAF officer and former prisoner of war. The marriage was happy and stable, something she had not experienced since Henri's death. With marriage came resignation from intelligence work. She had decided to attempt civilian married life once more. The couple returned to Australia in 1959, and Nancy attempted a third time to find peace and purpose in her adopted country. They made one more attempt at electoral politics, but were again unsuccessful. Eventually, they settled in Port Macquarie, a coastal town in New South Wales, north of Sydney, where they lived quietly for nearly 4 decades. John Forward died in 1997 after 40 years of marriage. Nancy, now widowed a second time, lived on into extreme old age. In 2001, at age 89, Nancy returned once again to England, the nation where she had trained as a soldier and where she had lived during the war. She took up residence in a nursing home for veterans, where she lived out her final years. She was interviewed extensively by historians, journalists, and documentary filmmakers. She wrote her autobiography, titled The White Mouse, in which she provided an account of her extraordinary life. She became recognized increasingly as not merely a historical figure, but as a living embodiment of a particular form of courage and commitment to principle. Nancy Grace Wake died in London on August 7, 2011, at the age of 98. She had lived through the entire 20th century's major convulsions: 2 world wars, the rise and fall of fascism, the Cold War, and the transformation of the modern world. Through it all, she had remained fundamentally the same: a woman of fierce principle, absolute courage,
and unwavering commitment to fighting injustice wherever she encountered it. The legacy that Nancy Wake left behind extends far beyond the medals and honors that recognized her wartime service. She demonstrated concretely and undeniably that women were capable of the highest forms of courage, leadership, and tactical and strategic thinking. She showed that gender was no barrier to military effectiveness or moral clarity. She proved that an individual of principle could, through determination and skill, accomplish extraordinary things even when arrayed against vastly superior force and resources. The Auvergne-Maquis would have been scattered, disorganized, and vulnerable without her presence. The Germans would have suffered fewer casualties and had an easier time containing resistance activity in that region. The French civilians under her protection would have suffered more severely without her organization and leadership. More broadly, Nancy Wake's life stands as a testament to the power of conscience. Born into privilege and comfort, she could have remained insulated from the suffering of the world. She could have raised a family with her wealthy husband and lived a life of comfort and security. Instead, she heard the cry of injustice, first as a journalist witnessing Nazi brutality in Vienna, later as a woman seeing the machinery of occupation and persecution consume France, and she responded with her entire being. She put her life at risk. She sacrificed her personal happiness. She endured hardship and danger beyond what most humans ever experience, all in service of a principle, that fascism was evil and that it was worth fighting, worth sacrificing for, worth dying for. That legacy of principled action, of refusal to accept injustice, of courage in the face of overwhelming odds, is perhaps Nancy Wake's greatest gift to history. She showed that one person, animated by principle and possessed of courage, can, indeed, change the world.